From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. And ahead today, K-State's Glynn Tonsor will offer this week's insight on the cattle markets. He'll talk about the latest positive news on U.S. beef exports. And he'll comment on whether the recent modest improvement in cattle futures prices will help the fed cattle market stay above that $100 mark. Then K-State's Walt Fick will talk about controlling woody brush in pastures here in the fall. He'll go over the preferred herbicide options and their respective effectiveness against locust, hedge, and other invasive hardwood species. And further ahead, this week's 4-H segment, K-State's Beth Hinshaw will talk about the upcoming 48 hours of 4-H Community Service Weekend. All this and more on Agriculture Today.
Have you ever thought about where your food comes from? If you're thinking the grocery store, think again. Facts show that the American farmer feeds more than 129 people.
They are continually increasing and improving their operations. A wide variety of crops and livestock are grown in Kansas as well as the United States, providing food to your dinner plate.
Next time you see a farmer or rancher, thank them. For more information, contact K-State Research and Extension.
For this week's cattle market insight and commentary, we bring by livestock economist, K-State Research and Extension, Glynn Tonsor, who, along with everybody else, is noting the slow erosion of the fed cattle trade. Glynn, we'll start with that. Another $1 down on the fed trade.
Yeah, and actually the fact it's only down $1 might sound like good news because we've had a few bad weeks. But on balance, let's start with the cash market. And as you said, the fed cattle market was off about $1 this week, referring to the Thursday 5-market trade. I will say the volume is fairly low, so there's going to be a tone throughout all my cash market comments about volume this past week is pretty limited. Mm-hmm. But specifically, it was about 103 for the 5-market average on Thursday. When we go to cash feeder cattle, Thursday in Woodward, Oklahoma, for example, is one of the few that had a fair volume with it. 5 to 6 weights for trading. It's a wide range, 147 to 163. A little tighter range on 6 to 7 weights, 156 to 161. But I would assert that we're still fairly low volume in many of the feeder cattle cash markets. We're on the front end of that wave of cattle that's coming. And I'll speculate a little bit that maybe that's why the cash market, feeder cattle in particular, was flat, if not down a little bit, which was at odds with the board this week. So maybe that's just a low volume in the cash trade kind of story. So I alluded to this. Flip over to the board. Feeder cattle October contract was up a full $5 for the week, so it was a strong week. Not quite 149 on the board. And then live cattle October contract was a little under 108, which is up about $2.50 for the week. So we picked up on that difference on the board versus cash trade. As a bit of an aside, we often talk for the last couple of years, the quote-unquote disconnect between the board and the cash market. And usually that has came up when various analysts have noted the board has come down when cash trade was flat or going up. Well, in this case, I have to politely note out it's the opposite. Yeah. So this does happen. There is no written rule saying those two always go the same direction. That is basis variability by definition. And this is a week where it's in a good way, if you like, if you're exposed to the board. So I will note that is the contract isn't just quote-unquote against one side. Why the board was up this week and cash wasn't is a little hard for me to speculate on. Maybe there's just some more bullishness among the traders than there is the actual buyers. I'm going to leave it with the low volume in cash trade and not overreact to it. If nothing else changes in the world between now and next week, the cash market might, bounce up in response to a strong week on the board. So that would be a sliver of hope, particularly for fed cattle, as you noted with your opening comment, is we've had notable erosion in fed cattle prices.
It would be premature to declare that the futures are setting the floor for this market right now, though.
I would not be in that camp. I'm not comfortable calling a floor anywhere. There's a lot of positive demand stuff we're going to talk about in a minute, but there remains notable concern for the next 2 or 3 months of kind of handling all these cattle and some uncertainty about how many cattle there's going to be, particularly at feeder cattle side. There's a little bit of uncertainty about how many we've already pulled into the system from the north. What does that mean to the total that's going to show up in these auction barns, October, November in particular? I think makes the whole market a little bit just almost called queasy, and that's why maybe they didn't react the way the board did this week, I think.
We did talk last week with your counterpart at Iowa State University, Lee Schultz, about the fall calf market and the prospects for those who have spring-born, fall-weaned calves on hand as to whether to retain, whether to sell, what might work best for them. You've put some numbers together as well to shed further light on this.
Yeah, so I did listen to the interview, and you two do an excellent job as always. But seriously here, I did want to note that I agree with the core points that I'll remind our listeners. Knowing your cost of gain, comparing them to expected value of gain is a well-known way to make the best out of those margin decisions, and I fully agree with Lee's remarks there. So I'm not going to repeat them here today. But what I wanted to share was a little bit longer run pattern kind of note, and it's actually some LMIC information just to give us some context. And I'm going to use the November calf price relative to the March yearling price just as one example of this story. So pretend you're a producer who regularly sells in November. You contemplate retaining ownership or buying somebody else's and selling the following March. Going back to 1998, the long-term average price relationship between that yearling in March relative to the calf in November is about 90%. So in other words, we have a 10% erosion in a dollar per hundredweight once it becomes a yearling. That's very common. Heavier weight animals are worth less than lighter weight animals on average. We see that all the time. But there's massive variability underneath that. There's a real kind of story to that. Just look at the most recent 3 years. This most recent year was a really good year for somebody that retained that calf and sold it as a yearling in March, because basically the market was flat. We only had a 2% erosion between the November price all the way out to March as a yearling. So if you have a fairly flat feeder cattle market and you have anywhere near average cost to gain, that was a really good exercise in hindsight. And the main reason people remember, we had a positive development in the feeder cattle market the first 2 or 3 months of 2017. So somebody was rewarded for going long the feeder cattle market. That's what that was. Well, conversely, the prior 2 years, so had somebody bought an animal in November of 15 or November of 14 and then try to put those pounds on and sell it the following March, you kind of had your head handed to you on average. And the main reason to the point that relationship was about like 75%. So yearling prices fell pretty strong relative to those calf prices. And in many ways, that's because we had really high calf prices. I'm not saying the yearling price fell apart. It's just we paid a lot up front. Mm-hmm. Well, there's a big difference between a 75% relationship and a 98%, and we observed those two extremes just in the last 3 years. So I think it's good to know that 90% kind of rule of thumb of kind of best guess what to expect. But I want to caution everybody and remind them of the variability in that decision. And at face value at the moment, expected value of gain gives us value of gains in the basically 84 to sometimes even $90. I want to say mid-80s for almost anything of buying an animal in November and put some pounds on to next spring. So that's very attractive because a lot of folks are going to have cost in the, let's just say, $60 to $70 per hundredweight range. There's a little bit of variability there, but in general, it's going to be a favorable situation. But I want to give everybody the appropriate pause to consider risk management given the variability we've seen just in the last 3 years.
And to follow up on that briefly, something again Lee Schultz noted, because of the dynamics of the market, one should have contingency plans all through this process until they actually either move or fully commit to retain those calves.
Yeah, I agree entirely with that. And frankly, the market offers opportunities differently week by week. So it's not something you can wait and show up in this story on November 10th decide to do. I would encourage everybody to do their homework. There's multiple online resources to help with that. We've alluded to those over time. I encourage people to use those, whether it's on Ag Manager or the Iowa Beef Center for a lease case or whatever it is. Make use of those things. The other thing I'll assert there, and I'm not saying everybody has to hedge, but if you have a week like we just noted earlier where the board is offering an advantageous relationship relative to cash market and you are somebody that's comfortable with taking positions and have experience doing that, being in position and having a relationship with a broker and all those kind of things, seize that opportunity. If you wake up one day and then decide to act upon that, you can't do it the next day because you don't have those relationships in place. So I'll get off my pulpit there a little bit, but I think being prepared to take advantage of opportunities is step one, and then ongoing homework to identify those opportunities is step two. Step three is to act upon them.
Well, to the upbeat news this time around, the latest export figures for U.S. beef from the Meat Export Federation indicates what you describe as a red-hot market.
Yeah, so there's no doubt that exports have been, I don't want to say a savior, but the strongest part of this story throughout 2017. The July beef exports were up in aggregate for beef 5% compared to the prior year, and that's on volume. When we go to value, which is much more important, they're up 18% from the prior year, and that's the highest since December of 2014, which in many ways was kind of the peak in the aggregate demand story, for those who remember how good the end of 2014 was. When we look at one specific market, I think it's very instructive, so let's just look at Japan. Volume to Japan's up 20% compared to the prior year, and the value is up over a third, 36% up, for a total value of almost $200 million. So $176 million of value went to Japan in July alone. That's the largest since 1996, I believe is what I wrote down. I highlight that not because I'm just trying to call attention to Japan, but more generally, there's several very successful markets. And we need to recognize that export growth is a big reason that we don't have lower prices than we already have. So I noted earlier some of the concern. There's a lot of discussion whether we will or won't break that 100 mark on fed cattle price. We are getting close to it. That may well happen in the upcoming weeks. There's a lot of bearishness underneath that. But quite honestly, it could be worse if we didn't have a strong export underpinning to that. The reason we have lower prices there is everybody knows we have larger supplies, but we have a fairly strong export demand base that's helping keep those numbers from being worse. Mm-hmm. We would have well below 100 today if we didn't have the strength in the exports that we have compared to a year ago. And I think it's very important for everybody in the industry as well as our policymakers to note.
Well, very important flotation device for the market right now.
Yes, it is.
Lastly, for the week ahead, of course, there are concerns that a psychological barrier in the Fed trade might be approached here, and that is the market falling below $100. Hard to say if that's in the cards or not, but what's the tone of the market, do you think, going forward?
It's hard for me to predict. When I'm asked, it will not surprise me if we break that psychological $100 simply because of the supply concerns that are coming. Whether it's going to happen this coming week or not, I don't claim to have that kind of insight on. I personally don't think that psychological point matters a lot. Is if we hit 99 one day and we're back to 103 the 2 days later.
Yeah. What does it matter? Right.
But there is a lot of discussion about it, I understand. More importantly is what is it doing to margins? And the direction is wrong for anybody that's in a cash situation. If they were not protected and they're exposed to that declining market, they're very much upside down a little bit more every time they place cattle at the moment. The bigger concern for the rest of the industry would be what does that do to feeder cattle prices? So I shared earlier some positive feeder cattle prices, and we're actually projecting a positive return for an average cost cow-calf producer. There's nothing of that guaranteed, and if some of these losses to the feedlot, I should say when some of those losses get passed back onto the feeder cattle market, that will squeeze those margins for cow-calf sector as well.
Glynn, we appreciate the analysis. Thanks for coming over.
Thanks for having me on.
And joining us this time around to talk cattle market trends, Glynn Tonsor, livestock economist with K-State Research and Extension. We'll return with more after this. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
Did you eat today? Thank a farmer. A way to get more involved in agriculture is through 4-H and FFA. Through 4-H and FFA, we have been given multiple opportunities to grow as leaders and learn more about agriculture.
You can learn skills related to jobs, public speaking skills, and you get the opportunity to travel around the country and meet new people.
If you want more information about getting more involved in 4-H and FFA, visit them on their websites at kansasffa.org and kansas4h.org.
We're back now on this Agriculture Today. Well, it's a constant battle for our grassland managers out there, keeping invasive trees and brush from invading our grass resources. And here in the fall, there's an opportunity to treat through a couple of methods, a number of these invasive species. And we'll look at the options for doing so now with Walt Fick joining us. Once again, he's a range and pasture management specialist, K-State Research and Extension. What we're looking at here, Walt, are two procedures here, basal bark or cut-stump treatments, and there are all sorts of alternatives under each of those, right?
Yes, and both can be effective. Usually the distinction we make in terms of which one to use probably has to do with size of the tree. If it's more than 4 to 6 inches in diameter, we would probably recommend doing a cut stump, because with a cut stump, all you need to treat is what we call the cambium. It's kind of the outer living tissue in that stump, and so it takes less total herbicide, as that tree gets bigger, to do it that way, as opposed to basal bark, we're treating 12 to 15 inches high all the way around the tree. So you can use quite a bit of solution if you do that with a big tree.
But either of these methods can be effective.
Yes, they can both be effective. And like say, this time of the year, fall, and you've got a pretty big window actually. I kind of like fall and early winter. This would be a good time to consider doing this if you're at the point where you need to start reducing some stands of trees.
Well, let's go right to the herbicide options available and what might be more appropriate. Several of these are best applied with a carrier of diesel, correct?
Well, many of them are oil-soluble products, so that's indeed the case. There's one key exception. Remedy Ultra is probably the workhorse, I think, for basal bark and cut stump treatments. It's been around some time, but it is an oil soluble. So typically we'll use a ratio of about 1 part Remedy Ultra to maybe 3 parts diesel. Mm-hmm. And that makes a good mix, and we can do that either way with cut stump or basal bark. Some of the other products, of course, the active ingredient in Remedy is triclopyr. There is a ready-to-use product that you don't have to mix with diesel that has triclopyr in it. That's called Pathfinder 2, and it can be either way as well, basal bark or cut stump. Pasture Guard HL is another one that works well for these application methods. The label talks about a 25% solution of that product in diesel. Crossbow is probably the oldest product we've had around, and it works well on certain species and maybe not as well on some others, but it only takes a 4% solution of that product in diesel. A newer product that's been around now a few years is called Milestone. The problem that it has is it's water soluble, but for a basal bark application, you do need to mix it with some sort of like a crop oil to help it penetrate through the bark. You need to find out something that's compatible, though. You just can't pick anything off the shelf. You may need indeed to do what I call a little jar test. Take a little bit of the herbicide and the oil, shake them up, see whether they mix well, or does it start to gel up right away. If it's going to do that, well, it's probably not compatible. There are some products out there that work, but Milestone is really only effective on locust, honey and black locust. And then I was looking at the label the other day, and I noticed that redbud was also on that list. That's not necessarily a key target species, but that might be something that's out in people's pastures that they'd want to reduce. So Milestone would work on that as well.
With any of these, though, it's imperative that a producer gets good coverage, to put it that way, either as a basal treatment or the cut stump alternative, and you have to be sure that you are getting the product where it needs to be, right?
Yes, on a basal bark, as I said, you need to treat them maybe 12 to 15 inches high on that stump all the way around and down to the ground level. And then if you have maybe exposed roots even sticking out, it wouldn't hurt to treat them as well. The cut stump, again, if you have a stump there, maybe it's 1 or 2 inches high, you not only treat that cut surface, like say that outer cambium layer, but you want to treat the sides as well on that stump. Now, if they did a good job and it's cut right off at the ground level, then you wouldn't have to worry about that. But if there is indeed a stump there, you want to treat around the edges as well as the cut surface.
In the case of the cut stump treatment, though, you want to be sure and administer that product before the tree basically heals over?
Well, that's kind of a common recommendation. I think a lot depends on which product we're using. These products that are water soluble, like the Milestone or one I hadn't mentioned yet, is Tordon 22K, which can be applied to cut stumps in range and pasture as a 10% solution. Those usually, I think, within 30 minutes would probably be a good rule of thumb. The ones that are oil soluble, if you're using diesel, well, that kind of helps, get through that, any callus or that might be occurring on that cut stump. But, I think it's a good idea to treat fairly quickly. Depending how things are applied, we have people doing this commercially, and, they've got a rotary saw maybe that cutting off the stump, and then right on that same piece of equipment, they have a nozzle there. So they're treating almost immediately after cutting.
Which takes care of that issue right away. For those who might be so inclined, you say that with certain species, even something as basic as a treatment of dicamba could serve the purpose here.
Yes, dicamba, which is the active ingredient in Banville, Clarity, and some other products, can be used. Typically, the label has a range there, but let's say a 1-to-1 ratio of dicamba in water. There are trees such as ash, cottonwood, elms, oaks, Russian olive, persimmon, which is maybe a problem more in southeast Kansas. But those are trees that dicamba can work on quite well as a cut stump treatment.
If you'd rather not go the triclopyr direction, that's one possibility there. You also note in an article, by the way, that covers all of the options in the recent Agronomy E-Update newsletter, there are products that are restricted in use to non-cropland and non-pasture areas. If you're working, say, a bar ditch or something of that ilk, these can suffice, but just in those situations, right?
Yes, the common product is Tordon RTU, which has just a little bit of picloram in it and 2,4-D, but it's labeled only for non-cropland, can be used in fence rows around the farmstead. The other product, which has the same ingredients, is called Pathway, but those are both restricted basically to non-cropland areas, primarily because of the carrier that they use, that they don't want it, have animals have access to that.
Even glyphosate, you say, could be considered in some circumstances, Walt.
Yeah, you have to kind of look at the different glyphosate labels. Some of them are legal to use on range and pasture for cut-stump application in particular. I think Roundup Weather Max is one of those that can be used. But you look at those labels, and sometimes it says, well, it can be used on any terrestrial site. Well, that pretty well covers everything, so I think that would be fine to use in those cases. Some others, though, they might be strictly restricted to non-cropland areas, so it does depend on the formulation.
Read the label. That's always the message.
And again, the rates there with glyphosate for cut stump, it maybe 50% in water would be a reasonable place to start. Again, products like glyphosate, those Roundup products, and then the Banville, those are products that farmers probably likely to have around if they don't want to have to buy, triclopyr as remedy. They could try using those sort of products.
There's one invasive species that we haven't mentioned that can be rid of without the use of chemicals. Those familiar with eastern red cedar probably already know this, but if you clip them low enough, no treatment is required for kill.
That's correct, and as long as you cut it below the lowest green branch, it's a non-sprouting species, so that in itself can be effective. And, I think that sort of top removal, whether we're using fire or mechanical methods, that's the way to address eastern red cedar in my mind, rather than, they're foliar sprays, but, I would prefer those other methods.
But for the rest of our invasive hardwood species, and among the many we listed here, such as honey locust, hedge, so forth, why there are alternatives to consider. And Walt, you'd ask folks if they need more guidance to refer to the Chemical Weed Control Guide from K-State. The latest edition, 2017, covers all of this in full, does it not?
Well, I think most all of our recommendations are in there, or, like say, if they have access to these e-updates. This recent one we just did has tables in there that talks to these issues.
There's good detail in that article. It's in the E-Update newsletter posted on Friday, September the 1st, just recently. It covers basal bark and cut-stump herbicide applications for control of woody plants in pastures and rangeland. It's a timely project to take on once the window of opportunity presents itself in your schedule, producers, so give these alternatives due consideration. Walt, we appreciate you coming over. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric.
He is Walt Fick, Range and Pasture Management Specialist, K-State Research and Extension. This is Agriculture Today. We'll return after this break with today's agricultural news headlines for you. This week's edition of Tree Tales. K-State's Charlie Barton awaits with that. And once more, our weekly Kansas 4-H segment is still ahead. Here on the K-State Radio Network. Stay with us.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128 plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
You are tuned in to Agriculture Today. here on the K-State Radio Network. Eric Atkinson back with you as we check on today's lead stories in agricultural news for you now, courtesy in part of DTN. Well, Texas agricultural officials are fearing thousands of cattle may have perished in the aftermath of Harvey, resulting in losses to ranchers of tens of millions of dollars. The counties that sustained damage when Harvey first came ashore, August the 25th, were home to about 1.2 million head of cattle, representing 1 in 4 of all beef cows in Texas, according to the Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. Officials still in the process of tallying the damages. Texas A&M economists are estimating that Hurricane Ike back in 2008 caused about $13 million in cattle losses, with an additional $23 million in damages to fences, hay, other farm equipment. Harvey may be more costly because it affected a larger area, according to Texas A&M professor and agricultural economist David Anderson. However, he said he doesn't expect those losses to affect beef prices because the number of cattle lost in Harvey won't be enough to impact the national beef market, which is expected to yield a record amount this coming year. The latest trade numbers show no let-up in the pace of U.S. agricultural exports overall. Here's more from the USDA's Gary Crawford.
When it comes to U.S. agricultural exports,
things are headed on a positive trend.
Agriculture Department Trade Analyst Bryce Cook, we now have the official numbers for the first 10 months of this fiscal year, October through July, and we have sold to other countries $119.7 billion worth of ag products. Now, last year, same time frame, it was only $107 billion, so we're up 12% from a year ago.
That does have to do with the fact that the value of the U.S. dollar has declined substantially since the beginning of 2017.
Which, of course, in essence makes our products cheaper to buy for most countries, and that moves more products. So we have a weaker dollar helping to boost exports.
It also has to do with increased expectations of general trade on a global scale.
And Cook says we also have seen a little bit of growth in the overall global economy, resulting in export values for us ahead of last year for corn by 20%, soybeans 22%, wheat 31%, cotton 88%. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Washington.
On a related note, the U.S. Meat Export Federation coordinated a trip this past week to Japan. It included 20 U.S. beef, pork, corn, and soybean growers and association representatives. That group went to retail outlets, met with food service and trade executives, visited a meat processor and retail outlet, and gave seminars to consumers and trade representatives. Explaining the reason why corn and soybean exporting representatives came along with the meat trade reps, the president and CEO of the Federation, Phil Singh, said that 60 to 70% of the cost of raising meat goes to feed. He said they met with meat purveyors and talked about trade negotiations with a lot of focus on what's next after the U.S. withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Singh said the Federation is very concerned with the harm U.S. withdrawal from the TPP could do to trade. Meat exporters to Japan, though, can rejoice in the fact that the Japanese government has a stance opposite to the public health discourse here in the U.S. The Japanese government is advising their citizens to eat more meat protein, particularly their seniors. Want to remind you once again that the Senior Vice President for Markets and Food at the World Wildlife Fund, Jason Clay, will be the featured speaker for the Henry C. Gardner Global Food Systems Lecture here on the Kansas State University campus. That is set for this evening at 7 o'clock at McCain Auditorium. It is free and open to the public. The title will be Feeding the World, Sustaining the Planet. So looking forward to hearing from Jason Clay of the World Wildlife Fund presenting the Gardner Global Food Systems Lecture this evening at McCain Auditorium. We can hope you can take that in. If you can't make it, we would note that we plan to have Jason Clay as our featured guest right here tomorrow on Agriculture Today. And once more reminding you beef cattle producers of 3 meetings to learn more about the Sunflower Supreme Heifer Program being put on in the north and north central part of the state. These are taking place tomorrow. The first 9:30 in the morning in Plainville, the second at 1 o'clock tomorrow afternoon in Phillipsburg, and the last of the 3 tomorrow evening at 6:30 in Salina. Contact the local extension offices in those locations for more information. Now it's on to this week's edition of Tree Tales. Standing by with that, K-State forester Bob Atchison. Bob?
The 23rd Annual Fall Forestry Field Day has now been scheduled for Wednesday, October 4th, just north of Manhattan on Bill Kennedy's tree farm. Kennedy has been recognized by the Kansas Forestry Association and the Kansas Forest Service as a 2017 Forest Stewardship Tree Farmer of the Year. With over 27 years of tree planting and woodland management, Kennedy's Tree Farm provides an excellent hands-on learning venue for other landowners interested in managing woodlands. A variety of educational sessions will be held throughout the day. Landowners with invasive species like bush honeysuckle, black locust, and Sericea lespedeza will receive experts' best thinking for control and management of these and other unwanted plants. Concerns for tick-borne diseases is on the rise. Experts from K-State will be on hand to provide the latest information on control and protection from Rocky Mountain spotted fever, eulicria, and tularemia, some of the more common problems in Kansas. Understanding potential for wood products is another aspect of woodland management. Dave Bruton, Utilization and Marketing Specialist with the Kansas Forest Service, will discuss new advances in biochar and other specialty product opportunities in Kansas. More and more landowners are raising honeybees, and with the added concerns for declines in pollinators, a session will be offered on beekeeping and how to address the pollinator issue. Improving woodlands for wildlife habitat, recreation, and the beauty they provide are some of the main objectives for Kansas woodland owners. Kansas Forest Service foresters and wildlife biologists from Department of Wildlife Parks and Tourism will explain basic approaches to this important topic. A registration fee of $12 will cover the cost of lunch and morning refreshments. Registration brochures may be found on the web at www.kansasforest.org by clicking on News and Events or by calling the Kansas Forest Service State Office at 785-532-3300. This is Bob Atchison with the Kansas Forest Service at K-State, encouraging you to join us on October 4th for our Fall Forestry Field Day. You have been listening to another Tree Tale.
Many thanks, Bob. We'll be back with this week's 4-H segment in a moment here on Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
Now for you on this Agriculture Today, this week's Kansas 4-H segment. And the clock is ticking on a special event which takes place over a weekend in early October. This has been conducted for several years running now. It's the annual 48 Hours of 4-H Service event, localized. And we'll talk about what this is and how 4-H groups and individuals can participate. Along with us now via phone, Beth Hinshaw, Research and Extension 4-H Specialist for K-State based in southeast Kansas. 48 Hours of 4-H. You might go back to the genesis of this and what it's all about, Beth.
Certainly. Well, we are in our 4th year. So 4 years ago, our state 4-H Youth Leadership Council officers did a little bit of research about what kinds of projects were going on in other states in their 4-H program. And they found a gym in Texas where they do a one-day program. What our officers thought was, hey, what if Kansas 4-H did a day or a weekend of service is what they decided to go with. And so that's really where that came from. It came from young people looking and seeing what are good ways that 4-H could make a difference, seeing something that was successful somewhere else, and then crafting it to work in Kansas.
And really revolving around community service and the needs of, say, an individual city, town, rural area, what have you.
Exactly. You know, our communities support our 4-H clubs in so many ways, and it's an opportunity for our 4-H clubs to give back in their community and to make a real difference with some things that need to happen.
And Beth, for each of the 3 previous years this has been conducted, the response has been tremendous, hasn't it?
Yeah, it really has. And what's kind of fun is, the things that happen each year are different. And the part of the project overall across the state, one part may be more successful in one year, and then the next year it's something else that's more successful. So it really has been a great way for people to unite in service, across their counties, across their districts, and then across the state of Kansas.
And incidentally, the 2017 version of 48 Hours of 4-H is set for Saturday and Sunday, October the 7th and the 8th. To further illustrate the impact and how this is carried out locally, you have some numbers from 2016's event to reflect on, Beth.
Yes, I do. In 2016, we had just under 3,000 people participating in 2016, and of those, 475 were 4-H alumni. And then something that I always think is good for people to think about is this is a great way to get new people involved in your 4-H program. Last year, there were 49 brand new 4-H members that took part in 48 Hours of 4-H. Oh. And so, as they're coming in and thinking about 4-H, this is just at the right time of year to get involved right away.
And the kind of service, again, is self-determined by 4-H groups locally. The kind of ideas that emerge here, they're really varied, aren't they?
Oh, yes. It is so fun to read the reports and the kinds of things that they do. Most of our projects kind of revolve around either like a cleanup or a beautification project, or maybe some kind of a collection or a donation of goods. Sometimes it's an appreciation project where, they're finding somebody in the community that they want to appreciate. We've had a few groups who've done a veterans program as a part of their 48 Hours of 4-H program. And then sometimes they'll really take on a benefit or cause, so maybe something locally that just needs a little more oomph, to get going with some fundraising or something.
And as you said, it's a great way as well to promote 4-H through service at the local level. Now, there are a number of resources available to 4-H groups as they would put together their 48 Hours of 4-H activity that will augment that activity.
That is correct. And we'd love for people to go to kansas4h.org/48/4H. And it's also on the front of our website, too. There's a link. But there is all kinds of information there about what is 48 Hours of 4-H, what are the dates. There's an introduction sheet. There's an 8-page guide. There's a project registration form where you can look at the kinds of questions that we're going to ask you. We ask that every project be registered online just so we know what is going on out there. There's also a T-shirt order form. If you want to order T-shirts, certainly that is just an optional thing. And then there's even an attendance sheet so you can keep track of who comes to take part in your project. One thing that sometimes people don't understand is when we say 48 hours of 4-H, your project does not need to take 48 hours.
Right.
What we're saying is that in some part of that 48 hours of a weekend, of that Saturday, Sunday, what kinds of things could you accomplish? And it might be a 1-hour project, it might be a 2-hour project, or a 4-hour project. Several years ago, I think it was Wabunsee County took pretty much the entire weekend and just really biffed up their entire fairgrounds. So, they really took it literally, whereas maybe somebody else is going to collect food at the grocery store for 2 or 3 hours. It's, again, whatever your community needs, but it's just however that would fit into that weekend time.
So it's high time to identify that need for whatever service might be appropriate for this, and moreover to order those materials that will help support that, and that needs to happen ASAP.
Yes, it really does. They need to have had that discussion either in their 4-H club or their county council or district council. Even 4-H families could do 48 hours of 4-H. And September 19th is the day that you have to order T-shirts if you're going to do that. And then we would like the projects registered by September 19th. We know that some of that registration happens a little later sometimes, but definitely those T-shirts have to be ordered by September 19th so you'll have them in time to wear for your event.
Again, 48 Hours of 4-H is set for October the 7th and the 8th. There is a full complement of information at kansas4h.org. And once more, it's been 4 years in the running now, counting this year, and has met with outstanding success here in the state as 4-H'ers have fanned out and provided a myriad of services locally. We appreciate the word on this, Beth. Good luck with it, and thanks.
Thank you, Eric.
Beth Hinshaw with us, Research and Extension 4-H Specialist for K-State in Southeast Kansas. That is this week's 4-H segment, closing out our Monday edition. Thanks for listening in, and please rejoin us here tomorrow, won't you? Until then, Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.